Ava Lewis jolted awake at her lab desk, a cascade of papers fluttering to the floor. Disoriented, she glanced at the clock on the wall. 3 days had passed. Her heart raced. It was happening to her now. The city was in chaos. People whispered about lost time. Entire days vanished without a trace. Commuters found themselves at work with no memory of the journey. Families missed birthdays and anniversaries. As a leading chronobiologist, Ava was inundated with pleas for answers. But balancing her demanding career while caring for her aging father left her exhausted. She hurried home, fear gnawing at her. "Dad?" she called out. Her father sat in his armchair, gazing blankly at the television static. "You were gone a long time," he murmured. Tears welled in her eyes. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize." That night, Ava pored over her research. The phenomenon defied all known science. Desperate, she considered an experimental device she'd been developing, the Chrono-Stabilizer. Unapproved and untested on humans, it was designed to anchor one's perception of time. But there was a risk. Theoretical models suggested that activating the device could destabilize her temporal presence, potentially leaving her unstuck in time. She weighed her options: do nothing and continue losing precious moments, or use the device and face the unknown. Clutching the Chrono-Stabilizer, she made her decision. She couldn't stand by while time slipped away from everyone. The stakes were too high. The next morning, Ava stood before her father's room. He slept peacefully. "I might not come back," she whispered, "but I have to try." Strapping the device to her wrist, she activated it. A surge of energy coursed through her. The room flickered, shadows stretching unnaturally. Then she saw them. Amorphous figures lurking at the edges of perception, shimmering like heat waves. Her breath caught. "What are you?" she whispered. The entities turned, their hollow eyes locking onto her. For the first time, they realized someone could see them. They recoiled, then advanced aggressively. The Time Eaters were threatened by her newfound awareness. A tendril of darkness lashed out. Ava ducked, narrowly avoiding it. Panic surged, but she forced herself to think. Physical attacks were futile. She needed another way. Racing to her lab, she could feel the Time Eaters pursuing her, their presence distorting the environment. Objects around her aged rapidly or decayed into dust. She burst into the lab and sealed the door, but the walls began to waver. Frantically, she modified the Chrono-Stabilizer, configuring it to emit a reverse temporal pulse. If she could disrupt their feeding mechanism, perhaps she could weaken them. The door buckled as the entities pressed in. With no time to test her adjustments, she aimed the device at the entrance and activated it. A wave of temporal energy blasted forth, hitting the Time Eaters. They screeched, their forms flickering. But they weren't defeated yet. They regrouped, more enraged. Ava's pulse had only slowed them down. She realized she needed to amplify the effect. She glanced at the lab's power core, a fusion reactor prototype. Connecting the Chrono-Stabilizer to it could amplify the pulse exponentially, but the resulting feedback could be catastrophic for her. Another tendril pierced the wall, inches from her face. Decision made, she linked the device to the reactor. "This has to work," she muttered. As the power surged, the Chrono-Stabilizer glowed intensely. The Time Eaters burst into the lab just as she unleashed the amplified pulse. A blinding light filled the room. The entities writhed, their screams echoing in frequencies she could barely comprehend. One by one, they disintegrated, fading out of existence. Silence settled. Ava collapsed to the floor, breathless. Relief washed over her. She had won, but as she tried to stand, her legs wavered. The lab around her shimmered unnaturally. She reached out to steady herself, but her hand passed through the desk. "No," she whispered, dread sinking in. Not now. She stumbled outside. The world was a haze of muted colors and distorted sounds. People moved in blurred motions, unaware of her. She was unstuck in time, a specter invisible to the living. Despair threatened to overwhelm her. She had saved everyone else, but at the cost of her own existence. Tears streamed down her face as she wandered the streets. Eventually, she found herself back at her father's house. He sat by the window, gazing at the sunset. "Dad!" she cried, though she knew he couldn't hear her. But then, ever so slightly, He turned his head, as if sensing something. "Ava," he murmured softly. Her heart leaped. Summoning all her will, she reached out, and for a fleeting moment, their hands almost touched. "I love you," she whispered. A gentle smile crossed his face. "I love you too," he said to the empty room. Contentment filled her. Her sacrifice had not been in vain. The Time Eaters were gone, and people were no longer losing time. Families were whole, and life moved forward. Accepting her fate, Ava closed her eyes. She felt herself dissolving into the fabric of time, becoming one with the moments she had fought so hard to protect. The world continued, each second a precious gift preserved by her courage. And though she was gone, her legacy endured, a testament to the value of time and the lengths one would go to safeguard it.